delivered. Guam AutoSpot is extending our overstock sell-off with the hottest deals on island, like our 2025 GMC Canyon with $4,000 off. Or slide into a brand new Mitsubishi Eclipse Cross, starting at just $24,995. September is your chance to drive big and save even bigger. Visit us today or get pre-approved online at guamautospot.com or call 478-AUTO. Guam AutoSpot, where the savings never stop.
Buy fuel, get Wendy's. Drive to your nearest 76 Circle K and get free Wendy's. Yes, free. Fuel up with $30 and score your choice of a 6-piece crispy chicken nuggets or a juicy junior cheeseburger deluxe. Fresh, hot, and packed with flavor. But hurry, quantities are limited and this delicious deal won't last long. So hit the road to 76 Circle K, fuel up, and get Wendy's free before it's gone.
It's me, Wednesday Addams. I regret to inform you that I have devised the meal of misfortune with Wendy's. Normally I'd be against this type of capitalistic corporate synergy. But when the other pigtailed provocateur said I could concoct my own Frosty, I melted. My meal is tribute to the suffering that awaits us all. It's pure torture for your taste buds, with 4 nightmarish dips of dread. Don't waste my time asking which ones you'll get. You must surrender to your fate. Enjoy the anguish.
Dare to try? Something new? Life's too short!
You gotta chill with a snackable drink.
Life is too short. Hey, you gotta chill.
Mogu Mogu.
Moku Moku! Kandit News is brought to you by 76 Circle K Guam.
Have you guys seen that the meme that's going around on WhatsApp? It says forwarded many times. It's this fake. Someone made it look like it's a Guam Waterworks Authority official sort of graphic thing. It even has. It looks very professionally done, but when you read what it says, it's hilarious. Hold on, let me bring it up. Let me bring it up so I can read it to you. Stand by. It says. The things people come up with. So it's a glass of dirty water. I don't know if you can see that. Sorry. It's a glass of dirty water. And the yellow thing says, now with 30% more dildrin. Tired of boring old water that just hydrates? We believe your family deserves more. We are proud to bring you our latest flavor, Dildrin. It's organic, it's vintage, fresh from our wells to your family. Guam Waterworks Authority. And in the middle of it, it says, and it uses the logo, drink it all in with Dildrin. I just love our people. It is 6:10 p.m. on Saturday, September 27, 2025. My name is Troy Torres. Thank you so much for joining me. That we're not going to talk about Dildren or the water or Josh Tenori or anything, well, per se, or anything like that. But we are going to talk about housing, and it's because. So, have you noticed over the past? I don't know that I seem to remember this happening over the past. It's been at least 3 weeks, maybe a month, maybe more than a month. But when you go through Facebook or Instagram and you see the ads for homes for rent, before for the past several years, the homes for rent was something like $2,250 a month or $2,205 a month or $2,450 a month. And we know this and these numbers are in our head because for the longest time, that's how much the common rate was that was being charged for homes throughout the island. And it kind of almost didn't matter what the homes looked like. It was and it's because these rates are being charged because of what the overseas housing allowance is for the military, and also the caps that for GURA Section 8. That's why the prices have been so high. It's so artificially high, right? Have you noticed over the past several weeks, it might have been more than a month already, I'm not sure when I first started noticing this, what was $2,450 a month is now $2,600 a month. Now, I understand that's probably what happens when the supply, when the demand exceeds the supply and all this stuff, right? Or maybe the overseas housing allowance went up. I don't know. I don't know what the situation is, but it's getting even more expensive to rent on this island. And it's not like our incomes are going up unless you are part of the favored few. I mean, even if you work in the government of Guam, if you have a regular job in the government of Guam, you're not going to be able to afford $2,600 a month. I hope you have your own home or you're staying with your family or whatever, right? And so it's already happened. It's already happened where thousands of our people have had to move off island because of everything, including how expensive it is to live here. And it's getting more and more expensive. So it's already happening. We're already getting priced out of paradise. And the reason I wanted to do this live show is because the same reason I wanted to write the editorial this morning was because last week, going through all the craziness of the last week and all the news that there has been, something that I've been meaning to do was talk about this very urgent subject. And I really hope that our leaders are, I hope there's something coming down the pipe. I really hope that there is something revolutionary in the way of development or policies that will yield to development, incentives that will yield to development, federal funding that will yield to development beyond the $500 million that GURA already received, that the government of Guam already received for housing post-Malbar. And I say that because last week, the Navy announced the issuance of a solicitation that essentially says that by 2028, they are going to buy up or construct in the central area of Guam, meaning the private land areas of this island, nearly 1,400 housing units. And then by 2032, which is just 7 years from now, the balance of their plan of acquiring or building 2,400 housing units will have been completed. 2,400 housing units, which is just about 5% of the total number of housing units on this island. It's a significant amount. Within a 7-year period is, and then 1,400 of those within a 3-year period or less than a 3-year period. Our prices are really going to go up over the next 3 years, over the next 7 years. I don't know when there's going to be And this is not even considering our own growth in the civilian population. And what struck me as I was reading the Navy Times article about this was the commander of Joint Region Marianas. I forget his name. It's in my editorial. He says that he's doing this, that the Navy needs to do this to provide for an acceptable quality of life for the servicemen and women who will be coming here. And bravo to that guy. I'm glad they have a leader. The military has a leader who's looking out for the quality of life of his people. And they're acting fast. It's not just words. These are actions that are being taken. These are words after the actions that are being taken to provide for this quality of life. Where are our leaders to provide, to be concerned about our quality of life? And let me tell you what our quality of life is going to look like over the next few years if we don't drastically add to the housing inventory. What's going to happen over the next 3 years as the Navy and its contractors rush to build or to acquire 1,400 homes in the central area of this island is it's going to suck up the housing supply. And that alone is going to drive up the price of homes again. The price of a house now already is unaffordable for a regular middle-class family. Ness LG says, I work for GovGuam and I cannot even afford to live alone and rent. High rent prices, water and power, extremely expensive, and has cancer in it. Don't forget that. And I cannot qualify for any federal assistance or housing assistance. I hear you, niece. Sorry, I said Ness. Niece LG. I hear you. I'm in the same situation that you're in. But I don't work for the government, but I'm in the same situation that you're in. I don't qualify for public assistance, and the price of my rent is it's high. And I don't plan for this. I've learned to put things in God's hands and to just trust my security in the Lord, and He's provided, thankfully. And but if I were to think about it, if I were to worry, it would be such a worry. It really would be, because my rent is so high. And it's just like everybody else's rent, right? Unless you're lucky enough to live in a place where, for whatever reason, your landlord is not charging you $1,700 a month, or $2,205 a month, or $2,450 a month, or $2,600 a month. I've even seen rent for a regular house for $3,200. It's insanity. And it's only going to go up because as the Navy builds and acquires these homes in Central Guam, it's going to suck up the housing inventory, making what's already available that much more expensive. And then when it needs to build stuff, it's going to suck up all the construction materials, all the laborers, all the construction workers. It's going to suck up space on the ships, and everything else is going to get that much more expensive, because then shipping will be an issue. There was a time not too long ago when the pay for a laborer for the day is about $150. Now it's $350, $500 a day. Imagine what it's going to be over the next 3 years when this demand from the naval housing construction project starts. It's not going to be good for us. I'll tell you that. And so what is the solution? It's the same solution that should have been implemented for the past several years, because the government of Guam, even without this announcement by the Navy, even without this military buildup per se, as long as there were personnel who were going to come here and use the overseas housing allowance and want to live off of base, or are allowed to live off of base, or needed to live off of base, this was always going to be a problem. And while we had major affordable housing initiatives in the Camacho administration, and then followed up in the Calvo administration, and some trickling in the Leon Guerrero administration, it hasn't been enough. The congressman still hasn't done anything about the fact that we are living by the OHA rather than the basic housing allowance, which would theoretically reduce rent costs, because the rent costs are artificially high because of the overseas housing allowance and because of Section 8. For time immemorial, how many governors now have failed to, in a radical way, raise a workforce of construction workers and laborers who over the next few years are going to be in high demand and are going to be making a lot of money. The problem is they're not, most of them are not going to be from Guam because we haven't trained enough to take this is why we have so much foreign labor. And most of all, the housing inventory itself. And it's kind of crazy when you think about it because, all right, the military and the federal government, they sit on about 1/3 of the landmass of Guam. The government of, I mean, the private, the homeowners, business owners, the private sector, right, owns the other 1/3 of land of this island, which is not a lot when you think about that. In this island, only 1/3 of the land is in private hands. And then the other third is government of Guam, most of which is Chamorro Land Trust. Chamorro Land Trust being instituted in 1975, 50 years ago, is when the Chamorro Land Trust Act was passed. It wasn't implemented until Carl Gutierrez's first year as governor in 1995. And what is 1995 to 2025? What is that? 30 years later. 30 years later. Thousands of people, I think it's 10,000 people, most of whom applied in 1995, remain on the list, have not received leases to the Chamorro Land Trust properties, and it's because of a whole bunch of different reasons. The non-surveying of the land, there's no power, water, and wastewater infrastructure, the lands are undeveloped, et cetera, not ready for, and the program itself has gone through, eras of corruption, mismanagement, et cetera, right? But 30 years of governors, legislatures, Chamorro Land Trust board members, 30 years of funding the Chamorro Land Trust Commission itself. And 10,000 people still on a waiting list. And a housing crisis that already is happening, and an even larger housing crisis that will loom. The solution, because the pressure relief valve is on the other side of the private lands, it's on the government side of the lands. The pressure relief valve here is to get these lands out into the hands of people so they can build. And we might be at a point we are at a point where it's not even going to be about, okay, let people just build on their own. Now it's going to be, we need a developer to come in and build these homes. We need to leverage whatever. Department of Agriculture funds, U.S. Department of Agriculture funds, U.S. HUD funds. I don't know. Something. Does anyone have a plan to increase our housing inventory radically, as in increases of thousands of housing units over the next 5 years, so that we can have some semblance of affordability in housing, so our rents aren't that expensive? And that isn't even considering, like, well, okay, we're gonna build all these thousands of new homes. How are we gonna get the construction workers to do it? And do we have the capacity to bring in, via shipping and whatever, the construction materials? I don't know. There have been, Chris Duenas and Joe Augustine, and there have been pieces of legislation that have passed, and then there's legislation that's there in the legislature. I think even Therese Terlahi has something, if I'm not mistaken. She's got something. So there's some action being taken, but it sure as heck isn't enough. So what I wanted to do tonight, as we ponder all this, right, is take a look at what GURA Deputy Director Fernando Esteves said during the housing symposium back in January or February this year. I've never watched this before, but I hear that there's a lot of good information in it, and perhaps we can get a sense of what it is that the executive branch is planning to do. And this was, of course, before the Navy made its announcement of the need to acquire or build 2,400 more homes over the next 7 years, 1,400 of which will be in the next 3 years, which is crazy. Like this, I mean, the good for the Navy. They're planning right for their people and the quality of life of our military servicemen and women, who absolutely deserve to have a great quality of life. Where are our leaders for our quality of life? Gosh, I wish the Rear Admiral was our governor, because if he's that concerned about the quality of life of the men and women in uniform there, if he were our governor, I would hope that he would be concerned about the quality of life of the civilian population, because who is concerned about us in the civilian population? Because I'll tell you this, the government gave us cancer-laced water, and they cared so little about us that they didn't even tell it to us. They didn't even let us know. They let us just drink the water. Anyway, here's Fernando Estevez. This is back in February or January this year, whenever that was, that they had the symposium, the housing symposium over at the, I don't know where this is. Maybe this is the Deuce. Maybe this is the Hyatt. I'm not sure, but here he is.
Instability really exacerbates societal problems. And that's the key thing. Housing is not just housing. Housing affects every part of our society. The issue and the tipping point that we don't want to get to is that the societal problems far exceeds our government and nonprofits' ability to address them. We have limited resources. We're far out here, so tyranny of distance. Housing instability has direct causal links to substance abuse, mental health disorder, suicide, reduced life expectancy, domestic violence, sexual assault, poor child development, and future homelessness. So there's a couple key terms that we look at when we talk about housing instability, and it's a broad term. Most people are familiar with the traditional sense of homelessness, which comes in various forms. So homelessness is having no home or a permanent place of residence. But as housing professionals, we have to look at other categories if we want to try to solve it. An additional housing unstable household is a household that's unburdened, which is a household that has housing costs, and housing costs being shelter costs plus utilities costs of over 50% of their gross household income. And we'll have a bit more data on that later. Crowding, having more than 2 people per bedroom. Doubled up, having more than 1 family per housing unit. Multi-generational households, where there are 3 or more generations in one household. And for Guam, let's be very clear, and we always make this distinction. When we're talking about intergenerational, multi-generational households, are not those households that choose to live together out of a communal sense or cultural obligation. It's those households that live together because they have no other opportunity, right? You're moving in, your son and their family and another family, because the alternative is street homeless, right? So we want to make that distinction very clear. Key factors that adversely affect housing affordability and availability are the low supply and high demand, which is a common theme, and that's part of what we're discussing today. Cost of construction by way of competition for labor and materials, and induced population growth, which is something that we're monitoring very closely. So a couple of key data points that we utilize amongst many. Pent-up demand, based on the last study that we did, is a need for 6,650 housing units by this year, which we're obviously far behind the curve. And that doesn't exclude calculations to account for Department of Defense activities. Organic population growth at the time in 2019 was estimated to build up a need of 2,768. So that leaves a net need by 2025 of a little over 9,000 units. So actually not a little over, my apologies. New housing units needed, it's about 10,000 units by this year. We can obviously fine tune that number, but it shows that there is a great need to start production. Another key factor is based on the documents that we have, research and analysis, and reports by the Pentagon. Department of Defense induced population growth between 2015 to 24 is approximately 15,000 people or more that have come to the island. And there's a projection of an additional 7,228 by 2029. On that common theme, the current DoD utilization of community housing is about 9%, a little greater than 9% of the total community housing inventory. So our last projection, there was about a 68% utilization. So 68% of the Department of Defense requirement for housing is taken up by the community. So the community provides 68% of their housing needs. The community shortfall projected for Department of Defense activities for 2029 right now is 2,881 housing units in the community. We've seen an increase, a significant increase of 29% of the hidden homeless. And I apologize, I didn't mention this. So the other housing unstable category is hidden homeless. And those are household members, related or unrelated, who wish to move but can't for financial reasons. So it's just an individual. These are your couch surfers, your uncle, your friend who has no place to go and they're just bouncing around. That makes up the pent-up demand. So hidden homeless increased based on the last count by 29% from 2009 to 2019. So this was despite having constructed over 1,300 new homes within that 10-year period. Home construction right now ranges between $250 to $341 per square foot. That lower end being for larger developments, so economies of scale. So you could probably still get that $250 price if you're building many homes at once, but you're looking at about the median of that price range. One of the new data sets, now that we have data from the 2024 PIT count, is that homelessness increased 38% from 2020 to 2022. And so we did consider that that's a statistical outlier primarily being due to COVID. But what did stand out was despite all the money being put into the community and as there's been a bounce back since COVID, unemployment went down, businesses reopened, housing programs continued, we still saw a 16% increase from 2023 to 2024. So if you look at the slide, you're going to see that we have some trends. From 2014 to 2020, you see a downward trend of homelessness from 1,356 in 2014, brought down to 790 in 2020. What we then saw was with COVID, that 38% increase, there was a gap in the count in 2022. And so, I don't want to say we ignore it, but we write that off as a statistical outlier due to COVID, right, and that immediate impact. But what's concerning is we're still seeing an upward trend, compounding upward trend in homelessness year over. So 23 to 24, we still saw 16%, which is still a significant number. So we're going backwards. So we were making progress on housing and homelessness, then we see a huge jump back up that's continuing to rise. So I'm an old Army guy. I like to use pictures to explain the situation and map it out. So there were a couple factors that when we analyze what has happened and what caused the state of housing as we're in a period ranging from 2015 to 2024. So starting, we saw historic lows on mortgages, which benefited some families getting their first home owners, but also benefited a lot of investors purchasing of properties and turning them into rental properties. And that was from 2015 to 2022 when that started to go back up. So as we saw interest rates go down, a lot of activity in the market. Construction costs went up, so that drove up inflation, induced population growth, and so we saw an in-migration of people coming into Guam. That coupled with limited inventory, increased demand, really decreased supply, created market compression, if you look up at the top, and gentrification. So that general term, gentrification, little different here on Guam. And when we talk about gentrification of Guam, we're talking about middle-income families who are now priced out of their home, who then take what little financial resources they have, depending on their spectrum of the middle class, and are now renting out units that were otherwise affordable or attainable for low-income families. And so you see a market compression, and it's pushing people further and further down until they're completely out of the housing market. Increasing pent-up demand. So besides people moving into lower units, they're also now piling up into multi-generational households. The other side of that are families, particularly those with college education and skills, starting to out-migrate. starting to leave Guam because they don't have an opportunity. So they may have a degree, the pay might be okay, but there's no chance at owning a home, so you're seeing them leave, or they can't afford rent, or they want to grow their family. So many reasons, but for the most part, the brain drain is the key issue here. So all of these things all lead and have compounding effects to housing instability, and ultimately is what we then see in the street, which is that traditional homeless. But there's a whole lot of other things that happen in between that time, and there's a whole unaccounted for group of individuals we have to plan accordingly for housing. Homelessness is the late sign. So, this wasn't planned, but this is Guam, right? We all know the diabetic. We've seen it before. Their foot is purple and huge with no blood supply, and we know what's going to happen, but we only see them after the leg is cut off. There's a lot that needs to happen in between that time, and this is what we're hoping to promote and work. So what does this mean? What does housing have to do with anything? Housing instability, as I said, it's a statement worth repeating, has many societal impacts. And so what you can see here, there's the big three: public safety. I probably should have made that public safety. Public safety, education, and health. And how does housing instability affect that? Well, poor childhood development, that's proven. Poor mental health, substance abuse, domestic violence, sexual assault, increased risk of sexual assault, poor health, early death. So let's put it into picture form. This is what we're trying to avoid. We're trying to avoid this, and this, then this, and this. So let's go over some housing terminology, because I think it's important that as we're looking at development, as we're looking at coming together to push housing forward and have plans, have objective and obtainable goals, we need to be speaking the same language. So what is affordable housing? Oftentimes you hear it discussed as a buzzword, right? People talk about it all the time, but, unfortunately, they may not know that it actually has a meaning. There's a definition, right? So knowing what it is going to better help us achieve what it is. So affordable housing, the standard definition, the HUD definition, and the commonly used definition is a household spending less than 30% of their gross household income on housing costs, which, as we established, are shelter costs and utility costs combined. On Guam, generally, affordable housing is synonymous with GURA's housing programs. You've heard the old terms, low-cost housing, the Section 8, right? Many different terms. But affordable housing specifically means less than 30% of their gross household income. One of the new terms that's coming up, I think it was coined by the governor of Utah and has been utilized a lot more in various states, particularly with the National Governors Association, has been the term, and thank you to the governor for using that term in her task force, is attainable housing. And attainable housing doesn't have a standard definition yet. Every state is kind of creating what that is, and what we're proposing to use as the definition, our guiding definition right now, is housing that is reasonably priced for unsubsidized, unassisted households. We try not to use, as much as possible, not to use the word affordable so we don't confuse people, but housing that's affordable for people that are not assisted by GURA, basically, because we have limited opportunities, limited funding in the housing programs that we have. So the other working definition are housing units of low to moderate density, priced with a target range of households that are 80 to 120% area median of the area median income, and we'll show that a little bit later. And that they're spending no more than 30 to 50%. So not quite affordable, they're not under that 30%, and they're definitely not housing, there's not housing instability by being overburdened of paying more than 50%. So we're trying to find that range there and look at policies that target those families. You may have heard this term before in news articles, is the missing middle. What are we doing for the missing middle? Who is the missing middle? Largely, they're comprised of unsubsidized moderate income households. And the moderate income, the middle class, has a large range. And so what we're talking about is that entrance range into the middle class, where you don't qualify for Section 8, you don't qualify for public housing, you don't qualify for any assistance, you no longer qualify for SNAP, and that huge gap between that and stability in the middle income market. So Guam's severe cost burden in Guam, there's a significant amount of families, and I believe based on the census count, about 52% of households on Guam are overburdened. I believe 51%, it's a majority. Sorry, I'll get that data. There's the average household on Guam, middle income, I take that back. The average household on Guam of middle income is paying 52% of their gross household income on housing and utility costs. So that means that means a good majority of the population is housing overburden. They have instability with their housing situation, and so that puts them at risk for all of these other health challenges. So for example, these households, one missed bill, one car accident, any number of situations can put them into homelessness. It just takes that one. So when we're talking about the income target range, I want to put the numbers up. Like, what does that mean? All these percentages, it's pretty boring, and hopefully none of you are sleeping yet, and I just realized I haven't been looking at this side of the room, so I apologize. When you look at the spectrum of income, we can look at the lower end, which is 80% of the area median income, and I think that was for 2024, and I think we're looking towards the update from HUD for 2025. 80% of area median income for Guam is a household making $60,160 a year. The upper middle class goes all the way up to the 200%, goes all the way up to the 150,000. So there's a huge price range there. So the target range that we're looking for as we're proposing, when we're talking about missing middle, is defining what that missing middle is. And where are we proposing to focus additional policies and programs to assist the missing middle, which are for those that are in the income target range of 80% to 120%. So families and households that make $60,160 a year to $90,000, approximately $90,000 a year. So as a matter of understanding, for households, in order to be affordable on Guam, for those that are just in the market, like maybe you didn't inherit a home that doesn't have a mortgage, and you're trying to purchase a home, own a home, or have a mortgage, or just rent and survive, Guam is only affordable to households making $120,000 or more. Or sorry, $120,000 or more. So 160% of the area median income. For those households, Guam is still affordable for their housing costs. For everybody else, it's not. They're going to fall within that higher range, anywhere from above 30 to about that 52% range. So area median income for Guam at 100% is $75,200. So that's the area median income. And so that missing middle, based on census data, accounts for 11,758 households, or at 3.5 estimate, 40,447 people that affects, fall in that missing middle category. So what we're proposing for the attainable housing range, and this is I don't want to say a moving target, but the policies can be put in place based on data models that moves and adjusts on its own based on how well the economy is doing, how well the community is doing. So it's not something that's static that you have to come back to the legislature or readjust the program every year or two. It moves with the community. So if the community does well, the programs do well. If the community is not doing well, it adjusts accordingly. So for the attainable housing range, we're looking at 30 to 40% would be ideal, right? Anything below 30% is affordable. Anything above 40% is really pushing close. But we understand, based on the data, that 40 to 50% programs targeting getting it down to 40 to 50% of gross household income is much more feasible, right? Just based on the math alone. That's a more realistic target range right now to get things more attainable for those families. So as an example, let's put this. How do we look at it? How do we do the calculations? It's similar to how we look at it when we are running our programs and we have to check income eligibility, right? And determine what the rent share is. And yes, for those who may not know, yes, our Section 8 and public housing tenants, I'll throw a jab in here. Unlike DOD, they actually do pay rent, right? HUD only contributes and subsidizes a portion. But the way our programs work, whether you're a Section 8 tenant or you're a public housing tenant, if you're making money, you have to pay a portion of the rent, and we cannot charge and never charge more than 30% of the gross household income. So when they say, our programs are affordable, yes, because we will never charge more than 30%, because it would become unaffordable or not affordable housing. So target housing costs. So what does this all mean? So if we're going to be talking about development, if we're going to be talking about tax credits, if we're going to be talking about any other program to help housing, who is it going to benefit? How do we determine that? How can we apply metrics to measure that, measure success, measure the amount of funding that's going towards it? So if you have a family, and that's the low end of the missing middle, with 80% area median income, they would be making about $60,160. So if they make $1 more of that, all of the other, for the most part, all of the federal benefit programs that they apply for, that they have, let's just stick with Section 8, if they make $1 more than that year, that quarter, or at the time they do their income eligibility, they're out of the program. No ifs, ands, or buts. Those are hard lines. They're gone. So what we've been seeing is a lot of the anecdotal data on the rising costs, right? So you'll see families building up towards self-sufficiency, both parents, if there are two parents in the household working, or when you have multi-generational household with multiple adults where they're all working. As soon as they come close to that line, because the leap is so huge between being in the program and leaving the program and being out on the private market is so huge, you'll see people quit working, right? You'll see them cut their hours. And so as a matter of policy and perspective is, we're here to provide opportunities, not judge people. It's not going to make any difference, right? That's a tough call. Make $1 more or be homeless. That's a very big leap. So, going back, 80% of the area median income, $60,160. I put that $1 there so you can see that difference between whether they're eligible for government assistance or not. 41%. So, 41% of their gross household income would be about $24,665. Utility costs, which is going to be power, water, sewer, if you have it, and trash service, around $500. So a unit that's 1,100 square feet, 3-bedroom, 2-bath, typical home for a family, not modest, not a mansion by any means, would have a shelter cost. So the target is trying to get the shelter costs to $1,505 or $1.36 a square foot. That's how much detail we want to look at this. The current rental market is $2 a square foot. So what we want to look is how do we have targeted programs and policies that get that down? Not necessarily overly subsidized to make it affordable, but get them to a point where they have a chance, right? Get them to the attainable range. So the current market, they would be paying, based on the current market, that same family would be paying 53.8% of their gross household income, or $32,400. So that's what that family would be faced with right now in the private market if there was no other assistance, subsidies, or didn't have family support systems to aid them. So we want to get that target housing cost to, another way to look at it is the rental, or that mortgage would be $2,000, about $2,000. So these are some of the programs, just so people may not be aware, some of the programs that GURA has for low to moderate income folks. We expend and we put into the community approximately $58 million a year. Thanks to HUD, of course, we really appreciate it. Good chunk of that goes into our Section 8 program. We house, at any given point, about 13,500 people, so about 9% of the population at any given time. And that excludes anybody in the LIHTC. While we may administer those tax credits, we don't count that towards our inventory. So it is a program that we have, but that's not included in that. We have the home program, provides home ownership to extremely low to low income households. CDBG, that does not provide permanent housing, but other community projects for low to mod income families. Public housing, GUMA Tranquilidad, special populations. Section 8, as everyone's familiar with, and we administer the low-income housing tax credits. We also have some self-sufficiency programs, smaller programs, but they really do produce results. So how do I sum this up? Is we're putting in $58,000 a year in various subsidies, but it's not enough. But the solution, or it's $58 million a year, yeah, and it's not enough. But the solution is not to go beg for more money. That's not going to resolve anything. These are subsidies that can get cut. These are subsidies at any point, and these are subsidies that don't necessarily help every family move on. And so what we're proposing, our plan of action. So GURA, we're going to continue our affordable housing program. So long as those grants keep coming in, we'll seek out new ones, and we'll continue, as HUD says. HUD says affordable housing, that's what it is. Their money, their rules. But what we want to do is promote more self-sufficiency and have an additional focus working with policymakers, private developers, nonprofit entities for more attainable housing. Policies, partnerships, and search for funding opportunities to increase attainable housing for the missing middle. And so it looks something like this. Like I said, I'm a pictures guy. GURA, with our existing and whatever new programs that may come, providing affordable housing. On the other end, we're also working on policy reforms and new programs to produce attainable housing. And on the back end, we're continuing to push our tenants and our clients to be self-sufficient and get them into the market, into attainable housing. And so what we're looking at, not a revolving door, but a cycle, because we're very limited in the affordable programs that we have, and we can't put somebody new in until they graduate out. And so, like I said, that gap, and as you can see, we've illustrated here, is too large. You're talking about another $20,000. So if they make $1 more, they're not qualified, but really they need to make another $20,000 more to even have a chance in the private market. So moving housing forward, policy reforms, we believe, are necessary to facilitate really meaningful development of housing. And I'm just noticing my back's bent. I apologize again. Existing programs are not going to address Guam's housing needs and lacks opportunities for households to transition to full self-sufficiency. New programs are necessary, designed to promote attainable housing for the middle class, for the missing middle. Approaching from both directions is really the only way we're going to resolve this. And we're not looking, we want to partner with you. Truth be told, Ms. Liz and I could write our term, run our programs, and just sit down and that's what it is, right? And just stick to our grants, but that's not going to resolve anything. Those programs can get cut at any point, and they're not designed truly to move us forward. So we need to work together to have long-term resolution and have permanent solutions to our housing situations. And so with that, that's the end of part one. Part two will go into the policy recommendations. So thank you very much, and I will hand it back over to Audrey. All right, now we get into the meat and potatoes. Okay, please, so just stay with me. I think I already lost some people, but that's okay. All right, so going into part two, and here we are. So what is housing? And I'm grateful to the executive director and governor who mentioned that. Housing is more than a house. It's a community. Community is the greatest determinant for societies thriving economically and socially. So what creates a community? Housing, healthcare facilities, education, public safety, and community interaction. This is also in line with the 2030 U.S. Health Service 2030 social determinants of health. And so community interaction can involve recreational facilities, senior centers, religious facilities. I didn't put that there because we don't pay for religious facilities, but that's also included. But oftentimes what you'll see are vibrant and successful communities are built around one or more centerpieces. You have university cities, college cities, college towns, communities built around hospitals, communities built around town halls, recreational facilities, or business activities. You have Silicon Valley. You have the former car manufacturing plants. And so community is more than just putting up some housing. It's about putting all of those components determine whether a community is going to be successful and thriving. Housing is just one piece of it. So the Housing Act of 1949, my apologies. So we went from, the federal government went from the Housing Act of 1949 to the Housing and Community Development Act of 1974. And that's what created Title I. So whenever you hear Title I, that's what they're talking about. And it creates a couple of important centerpieces for that. So what we've learned since then, since the housing projects that were done in the past, was that you can't take all the low-income folks and put them together. Right? That does not work. And that's where maybe you've heard this term before, the projects came about. So as a basis of 1949 Housing Act, when they started just building a bunch of housing, putting the low-income folks together, and there was a segregation and consolidation of low-income individuals without other community opportunities and community development, you created the projects. You created ghettos. You created high-crime areas. And so the term project comes from the old HUD term housing projects, which if you look on the board is still defined in our statute when GURA, so we still use those old terms, housing projects, but it's also synonymous with community development projects. So HUD updated, maybe there's an opportunity for us to update our term. So, but it's still called housing projects, they're one and the same. Guam Housing and Urban Renewal Authority is the corresponding agency for Title I grants, opportunities, and projects. And we're authorized to undertake housing projects or urban renewal projects as defined. So, as you know, as we're talking about, the reason I'm bringing that up is we have people here who may have not worked with GURA, who are not familiar. And so what our role is in proposing policy, planning, looking at community development, proposing projects, or executing projects all kind of falls in that category. So it's all in the name. We are the Guam Housing and Urban Renewal Authority. We're basically a duplex, okay? And so on one side of the duplex, you have housing projects. On the other side of the duplex is our neighbor urban renewal projects, which we haven't seen, but definitely haven't done since 1980. And so what you're mostly familiar with, and you can see the billboards and the community projects that we've done has been housing projects is what we mostly focus on. So it's pretty broad. We can do community facilities, infrastructure, parks, acquisition of property, any property and real estate, healthcare facilities, educational facilities. So we've basically done it all since GURA's inception. But it also accounts for planning, development, community planning and development, and also policy recommendations, analysis, things like that. So it's under that umbrella. So what we're seeing in the nation are, what you have here is a map for states that have enacted different and various legislation to increase housing supply. And so what you're seeing here are, let's see if it's, sorry. What you're seeing here, what we have the benefit of is trial and error. So we're not too far behind the curve, but we're behind the curve. But we have the benefit of trial and error because we get to see what other states have done, what other states have learned as they're trying to quickly catch up and meet the demands in the housing crisis. And so in 2023, yet 24 states began to work on various housing reforms. 4 states opted to do an omnibus, mean they did massive reform, housing reforms. About 11 others did 1 to 3 single topic, single pieces of legislation. In 2024, 25 states, another 25 states began continued or jumped in on conducting and executing housing reform. And of that, I believe it was another 4 that did an omnibus and 16 states that opted to do between 1 to 3 pieces of legislation. So in Guam, with the exception of spot or area rezoning, the creation of the hotel zone, we haven't had significant or meaningful changes to housing policy, land reform since the creation of the zoning of Guam in 1952. So what our recommendations are looking to reinvigorate, not necessarily deregulate housing development on Guam. So some of our policy recommendations. We have some new ideas. And so this is, I'll give you guys a moment to look at it. These are the areas that we're going to be covering today. They're not going to get too detailed on the specifics. What we hope to do is continue based on this toolbox that we're proposing, or this toolkit. We're proposing, if you want to work with GURA or work amongst yourselves to look at this, that the finer points of these policy recommendations are crafted. But of course, I speak with the board and the executive director that we're happy to work with anybody and work to craft meaningful policy for the development of more housing, particularly more attainable housing for the middle class. Okay, we'll go ahead and move forward. So first thing we're proposing are Guam housing tax credits. We believe the LIHTC program really works. It really does put out a lot of housing. The downside is that it's restricted to low-income housing for that. So we're proposing a similar program modeled like LIHTC, which can do acquisition, rehabilitation, or new construction of rental housing. And so the model of this program is it provides housing now, and the developer is paid through tax credits over time. It provides housing opportunities for the missing middle. And the nice thing that we're proposing in terms of the policy is that if we're matching it based on the target incomes that we're looking for, based on it moves with the community. So what does that mean? So if you're basing eligibility for residents that are moving into housing built through a program like this, then as the community does better, the rent that's collected from the property owner increases. Or as, let's say, the community or economy goes into a downslide, the rent also adjusts. And so it provides an opportunity of flexibility. So one thing we're proposing is, of course, a mixed income development, potentially a 1-3 ratio, 1 in 3 ratio. Middle income renters, specifically those between 180 to 120% area median income, have rents set and locked in between 30 to 40% of their gross household income. Low income renters, those making are 60 to 80% of the area median income, have their rent set at 30%. And this provides an opportunity. So if you're taking risk as a developer and building these units, if it's a unit that only has low-income folks, you run into challenges. You run into challenges not really just with profit, but trying to make enough to, as a cost increase, to maintain the unit, to do needed upgrades, to provide services. So to have potential credits that can go out that provide opportunities for mixed income development, mixed income communities, for low income and middle income, you provide an offset of the payer mix. One important thing to know is that it also, mixed income communities have also produced or reduced the risk of generational poverty. So I don't want to speak all fancy, but let me simplify it, right? When you have poor people hanging out with not just poor people, they tend not to be poor when they grow up. So if I'm speaking plainly, and I can say that because I grew up pretty poor, right? So you get that. But to put it plainly, you don't want to just clump, low-income folks together. It doesn't work. It's not good for the community, and it's not going to increase or improve their outcomes. The next thing we want to do is propose mixed-use zoning, which we're just throwing a designator there. It could be anything, but we're just calling it MU as a placeholder. Mixed-use development, they're typically categorized as walkable, pedestrian-friendly, mixed development type housing facilities / commercials. And they provide their residents and the surrounding residents a greater chance to live, work, and shop in single neighborhoods, reducing their dependency on car travel. We believe it's a responsible way to increase density without sacrificing opportunity or environmental safety requirements. They could be a mix of affordable and attainable housing options and units. Definitely improves cost feasibility due to maximizing the land use that's being used, and also, and we'll go into this a little bit, but maximizing the limited utility infrastructure that we have on Guam. It promotes community and economic activity, promotes public transportation by creating transit communities, right? It increases demand, and demand will drive the supply, right? So as people need to use public transit, then they're going to be using public transit, and then public transit will get better. And then it also may encompass cultural and other institutions as well. So you can have, maybe nonprofits nestled in some of these mixed-use developments. So as we're talking about maximizing available land, I think it goes without saying, right? Land is pretty limited here. There's swath owned by the federal government, large amount owned by GovGuam, and then a smaller amount owned by the private sector, private individuals. So let's go back because I don't want to say I came up with this great idea. They do mixed-use developments all over the country, to be honest. But, I don't want to take credit where credit's not due. But Guam Land Use Commission has been discussing this and came out with this in the 20-year Guam Land Use Plan, which we're still in, back in 2009. And what they proposed were village centers, community hubs with these types of mixed-use developments in the villages, and then other mixed-use developments, generally in economic corridors. So it's not necessarily a new idea, it's just been sitting dormant for a while. So this is on the 2009 Guam Land Use Plan, which is available on BSP's website. So this is nothing necessarily novel. We just want to move it forward. So as we were discussing utilities, this is a map from the GWA Master Plan. And I think what you want to point out is you see where some of the major water is running. Definitely along some of the main routes, but then you see a couple of empty areas, right, where either centrally or northern located that are infrastructure black holes. So you don't have main waterways or water lines there. You don't have the additional infrastructure of water wells and reservoirs that are supporting that, particularly in some of these areas, some of the ASEAN areas that could potentially see more housing development and support these mixed-use development communities, or along the island. Utility wastewater in particular, this is also from the GWA Master Plan. They're working. And what I'm trying to highlight here is that they're working to stabilize and make more resilient the current infrastructure that we have. And so what you'll see here is what they're proposing is in their planned upgrades, that darker orange, those are areas with existing communities and housing that they're trying to upgrade and actually bring sewer into. And if you notice, there's a high priority because these are all communities over the water well, the GPZ. They're all within the GPZ. So the reason it's important, and we're looking at this from a community planning and development aspect, is let's be realistic. We know they're years out from just trying to upgrade the major production and distribution systems, the sewage treatment plants, the main water wells, and they're trying to not upgrade and repair existing. The truth is, they're nowhere close to adding new infrastructure into new areas. And so when we're talking about utilities for mixed-use development, is those areas the legislature perhaps could designate as areas for these types of developments will maximize existing utility infrastructure in those areas, right? So these kind of exist in those same black hole areas without utilities. Power, the same thing. You can see there's very limited power infrastructure here. And so one of, potentially, and if you look at the corridor plan and the land use plan, there's some similarities there. That Route 15 area, again, too, there's a black hole there. So you have transmission lines, but you have the power substation in Paget, and then the power substation in Barrigada, which supports the eastern side of the island. And so there's no connection to increase power reliability or maximize distribution. And so potential economic, maximizing development opportunities, maximizing utility opportunities is going to be really important to housing development. And the reason I bring this up is as we're proposing more dense housing development, and we're not saying metropolitan, we're just saying, mixed-use developments, we want to make sure that the infrastructure is in place to protect the environment and that it's not overloading the current systems, right? So we really want to have intentional and planned development moving forward. So here are a couple of examples of small mixed-use developments. These are about 40 units per acre. That's 40 units including the housing units and the commercial units on the bottom. So they range between 40 to an acre. The largest one, depending on the height, goes up to 80 units per acre. So it's a good utilization of the land. I think one of the key things has been removing or limiting or providing alternatives for the parking requirement. And so they're popping these up and creating these transit hubs because you're able to build a lot more housing if you're not having to add all of this parking. Great examples too. Truth be told, this is what I envision. This is what I hope for to develop are these community level mixed use developments. Where you have a mix of social activities, community activities, great commercial opportunities, and then mixed income housing for people to live and work in those areas. One thing that we're proposing is perhaps the creation, short term, not long term, creation of a special fund. And we're just throwing out a name, a Community Development Trust Fund. We understand there's a projected revenue increase with the upcoming Guam tax assessment. And so as of note, the Territorial Education Fund or Guam Education Facilities Fund, as you may know it, FY25 was projected about 35 million. And that's the current going rate before the tax assessment. So we know values have gone up. We don't know exactly what that amount is. And what we're requesting or looking for is a temporary set aside of about 5 to 8% of that amount, net the debt service and T's and lease that are pulled off the top after the tax assessment is complete. So one thing that GER has had on the books forever is 12 GCA section 5115. GER is allowed to issue bonds and borrow money towards housing projects, but particularly bonds. This has never been used. It's a tool in the toolbox. It's never been used because we generally cannot leverage the federal grant we receive to pay a debt service. And so it's a tool that we could potentially use to have other less restricted local housing development go on, or to work as a leverage or mixed financing with other federal programs. But truth be told, GER is 100% federal funded. We don't receive anything from the general fund. There's no assistance or benefit from the local government truly to help the housing situation. We're looking at other, we've discussed with other organizations in the States. Some of them receive funding from the state, from the taxpayer base to assist. And so what we're asking for, and I'll just be frank, is a temporary subsidy to allow for some housing development, of which the program income from those rental units will make it self-funded. So if you look at the current allocations for the TEF or GEF, none of them are income generating. It's just money that goes away, it's never seen again. What we're proposing is support from the local government to create an income generating fund that provides housing for affordable and attainable households. That's going to be self-generating. And then, potential future uses are, you can leverage it with CDBG projects, community development block grant projects. And I like to use this example because this is the common misconception we have about government facilities. We can build fire stations. We can build police stations. And, oftentimes the public finds it odd, right? That, you have fire station here, brand new, but GFD is renting out in the DNA building for the headquarters. Or you got police here with the news station and, they're in Teedsen, for example, because the one hard restriction is HUD will not allow these funds to be used for the general operation of the government. So what we're talking about is having a self-funded local funding source, right, allows for more complete common sense projects, right, because it's all proportional. So HUD could say, or CDBG, based on the program requirements, say, yeah, we'll build the new police station or we'll build this. And then the GovGuam portion can come in and cover the administration portion, and it's a cost share, and then it's a full complete project. But from what I can see for the last 20 or more years, the federal government has been the one to fund the entirety of the project. So, their peso, their say-so, right? As the saying goes. So that's one proposed opportunity. One could hope. I'm looking at my oversight chair over here. Next one we're proposing are community land trusts. So federal nonprofit 501(c)(3)s can receive, and there are many grant opportunities that I've seen out there for community land trusts to put these together. But what we can consider, and that happens on its own, but what we consider are for local nonprofits, opportunities or grants that provide through local tax benefits for community land trusts. Particularly, I'm thinking about the Chamorro Land Trust. They generally wouldn't be able to qualify under 5103C grants, but there may be opportunities with the Chamorro Land Trust to provide community land trust opportunities if there was a local program that was generated. And so while, maybe family A, family B, family C may not be able to build their homes, right? There may be opportunities for them to pull their resources together and build a mixed-use development or a multifamily unit that, as they're eligible recipients or participants of Chamorro Land Trust, that they have a shared ownership instead of individual ownership. So it's another avenue that provides options for them. But the thing is that they maintain that ownership, you see. So renters are the owners in these types of situations. It tends to keep rents affordable and attainable, right? So they're the landlord, they're the owner, they're also the ones staying there. And so they maintain it themselves. And so you have that increased sense of pride, but it also provides opportunities, not just for those living there, but maybe if they're able to have commercial units that provide opportunities too for economic activity. So we could consider future grant funding to support this initiative, hopefully on the local side, particularly, something we can maybe do for Chamorro Land Trust properties. The other thing that we want to discuss, so we're far behind the curve. I understand there's a bill out for this. We've been pushing for this for quite a while. This is probably the most common and the quickest solution that has been utilized throughout the entire nation. And so that's what I mean when we're behind the curve. One thing of note, ADUs are Section 8 eligible, provided they meet the HUD's minimum requirements. And so that's something to consider, particularly because that's one of the hardest one of the most difficult units we have a hard time leasing with Section 8. Single bedroom studio units only account for 11 to 12% of the entire housing inventory. And so this encompasses manumku who are, looking to downsize or sell their home, single young professionals, maybe just a couple, who need these types of units, or, like a single mother with one child that would otherwise be eligible for a one bedroom unit can't find a place. And so this provides some of those opportunities. We do have some policy recommendations, though, with any ADU bill, and I apologize, Senator, I haven't read your bill yet. I'm going to get to it. But the main thing is that sewer is required, or that we can guarantee that the septic size is properly sized to account for the additional people. Detached, attached, or carport garage conversions, but maybe not require that there be a parking spot designated if it's an area that has adequate street parking, right? So it provides that option, provides an additional option. We do recommend deed restrictions on that. We can get into some of those details, but some of the deed restrictions that are used that you may see are, some people use an affordability period. Some states have prohibitions against a selling of an ADU, which is, it prohibits them from selling that single unit as a different ownership, like a timeshare type deal. I think these are some of the major, Jocelyn, correct me if I'm wrong, there is a lot of ADU challenges in Hawaii, right? We're using them as bed and breakfasts and Airbnbs. So we want to make sure that doesn't happen here. And that also deed restrictions to make sure they're using it as intended, right? So if it's meant for additional housing for, family member or as a rental, or I take that back, and that's happening. But what is not happening is they're building the ADU and they're renting it out as commercial space or as for their home office or any of those things, that an ADU is built to provide additional housing opportunities. So use as intended. One of the main things is that it's owner occupied. So at least at a minimum is that the owner is occupying the main dwelling before anything happens. Because what we don't want to see happen is this being used as a go around to have an R2 or mixed housing unit, right? Where the owner's nowhere nearby, but he's renting the ADU out to one family and renting the main house to another. Definitely don't want that. But definitely we want to keep it, so long as the policy can address these things, we're highly recommending to keep it simple. Make ADUs as an authorized use in a R1 as opposed to a conditional use, which is this is far below any threshold needed for conditional use permit. So it's about removing those barriers and simplifying it to get more housing out. And then also, so long as it's owner occupied, allow it to be rentable, right? We want to make sure as many people can use available housing units as possible, and everything's kind of within that market. Next policy recommendation is reducing the minimum lot size. So this hasn't changed much since the inception of zoning. We really want to maximize land use to provide more housing options to landowners and development. So if you look at 21 Guam Code Annotated 61501, just as a reference, agricultural lots, if with sewer, if located over the aquifer, you're limited to just under 0.22 acres, so a little under 10,000 square feet. Agriculture, if you're not located on the aquifer, you can go to 5,000 square feet. Current one, you can put one family dwelling in an R1 residential zone, one family dwelling per 5,000 square feet. So, as an example, in 2004, GURA constructed 20 affordable homes in Estumbo. And we still have these designs, they're public record. I think some people have used them, modified them, and built with them. 900 square foot living area of that home comes with a carport and also 2-car garage, carport, 3-bedroom, 2-bath, 900 square foot, sitting about 2,500 square feet. But unfortunately, because of the law, we had to build these affordable homes on a 5,000 square foot lot. So not the best use of the property, right? And so the reason we're really proposing this is if there's an expectation, as we're discussing in the utility slides, if there's an expectation for developers to invest infrastructure to bring in infrastructure, to buy up property, it can, this, and maybe as a, not a conditional use, but an allowance to reduce the lot size, is if they're gonna do all of those things. Nobody's gonna build, to be honest, the math doesn't math. Let's be real. The math just will not add up unless they're subsidized, and I'll go into that in a bit. The math does not add up for any developer, no matter how big their heart is, to build an affordable home on a 5,000 square foot lot. They're in the negative right off the bat before they even start construction or sell it. I'd be surprised if anybody would do it, but it just doesn't happen. The math doesn't add up. There's no market for it, not because they're chasing after a larger amount, it's the math doesn't add up. It's impossible. Now, when we talk about subsidies, when this was one of the big indicators that really red flagged us, is with our home program that builds houses for, it's a pretty limited grant, about $900,000 to $1 million a year. They can build homes for the low or below income households. They can build a home. But there's a maximum subsidy. There's a federal max to how much they can subsidize that home, which is $275,000. So even though we could put $275,000 towards the construction of a new home to get them in a new home, we hit a tipping point, and I want to say it was back in 2022. If Jolene's here, she can correct me if I'm wrong. About around 2022, where even if we maximize at $275,000 the federal subsidy, they still could not afford the remaining balance of that mortgage because the cost is just too high. That was a huge red flag on affordability and cost of construction. So if we can't do it, subsidizing $275,000, more than half of the cost of today's market, there's no way any developers could do it because we don't have a profit margin or motive in there. We're at zero. So the math doesn't math. So we need to look at being reasonable and providing these opportunities. So if you're asked, if a developer is going to be purchasing land, that's gone up in value. If the developer is going to be putting in utilities, which we sorely need to protect the environment, but also to provide for the residents and have good and future, reduce future infrastructure costs in the future, we need to make it beneficial. We need to let the math, 1 + 1 needs to equal 2 and not -50. And it's just being objective here. So, as I said, we built these homes on 900 square feet living area on a 2,500 square foot area. So that's the house and home with the carport and the setback. So let's reduce it, provided the utility infrastructure is there, something to consider. Next, height restrictions. This is since 1952. There was an amendment though, I want to say, God, we got forgotten your redevelopment here. But this was one of the few times the legislature went into the code and did anything aside from spot zoning. They allowed for Hagatnya redevelopment area, commercial zoning, when they created it up to 6 stories or 75 feet tall. Hotels at 6 feet or 75 feet tall unless they have a conditional use permit. But for everybody else, you can't exceed, was it 3 stories, 30 feet, pretty much, about 3 stories. And so that applies to agriculture, residential, multifamily, commercial, light industrial, heavy industrial. Sorry, and I'm not sure why it's not on here, but interesting enough, and I think we might have removed it. Interesting enough, and in R2, oh, sorry, that comes later. In an R2, you're able to build a hotel, and we'll go into that later. So there's a lot of inconsistencies there. We really have to clean that up. But what we're proposing is that notwithstanding the FAA, depending on the location they're trying to do this at, any engineering setbacks or other environmental restrictions, that the height requirements be amended to allow for up to 6 stories or 75 feet in multi-family, residential, commercial, or mixed-use zoning, right? So for these types of developments would have pretty stringent, particularly the commercial and what we're proposing for mixed-use development, are gonna have pretty stringent building codes anyways. So just allow the engineers to engineer, is what we're saying. Let the developer develop, and let's not try to micromanage what they want to do, right? And how they want to use their land, how they want to spend their money. Okay, so these slides, forgive me, they're not going to match. Credit to the National Governors Association who provided this. I thought it was something to consider. I'm not by any means an expert in this, but I think it is valuable information. And so through the National Governors Association in partnership with the Center for Building in North America, this credit to, let me go through the disclaimer here, credit to Stephen Smith, Center for Building in North America, as he presented and I attended the National Governors Association Housing Policy Leads webinar on planning, zoning, and building codes, so cited. So why should we care about building codes? I think he does a better job at doing slides than I do, right? Less busy. So why do we care about building codes? As they're discovering, multifamily construction, building construction in the US is very expensive to build. The reason being are some of the building codes that America has adopted. So for example, the floor plans are wildly inefficient, is what they're talking about. Here, I don't want to get too technical, but here they're showing different examples, how they do it everywhere else in the world and how they're required to do it in the United States because of the building code. So what the building code provides is what's called a double loaded corridor. It means simply because you have to put an exit here and exit here, that simple thing makes constructing these units so much more costly and is much less efficient in terms of the design. So there's limitations in design because you have this one requirement that hell or high water is just stuck because people just adopt the building code without seeing how it affects their community. This is their notices. We build with concrete, so I don't know how this really applies, but apartments dark, windowless, loud. So what they're proposing is instead of the double loaded corridors, is for state legislatures and policymakers, county folks who have adopted to the IBC to go into the code and amend these specific provisions. They're recommending the two right now. There's more that are coming, but these are the two that they're recommending state, county governments to go and amend, which is known as single stair reform, which means remove the double corridor requirement and allow, based on the policy decision, could be based on the height of the building, allow for a single corridor. And so this will allow for more efficient designs. So what does that mean? These tall, skinny buildings that you're seeing here, right, which could potentially, be utilized as a density option. So it allows for construction of these types of units. We have a couple of examples provided. The other one they're proposing is elevator reform. Like I said, I'm no expert by any means, but I thought it would be worthwhile to share. They're also recommending to go in and to adjust specifically the IBC on elevator reforms. Elevators cost somewhere like 4 or 5 times more in the United States than it does anywhere else. And they believe by having doing the elevator reform is going to allow access to the United States to the global market on elevators. It's a very specialized field to do the certification and maintain them, and the supply chain for elevators are very limited because of the US requirement, not necessarily the US requirements, but the high adoption of the IBC, which has this kind of standard in all of it. And so, you guys have seen the news where the elevator has been out at one of the, at a building, for example, for, I don't know, maybe like a year, right? Surprisingly, that's not a government of Guam building, so, you can't say it's all on us, right? It happens to other people too. But from a housing perspective, what we're trying to say is let's be reasonable. Let's look at the situation. If it's not an absolute need, let's look at potentially changing it and making that small course correction. Now, and I'm sure I'll hear this from my fire friends, no, but how am I going to get the gurney in, right? There are considerations for that, and they have tools to do that. But the main reason why, and I don't want to go into too much detail, you'll have the elevators bigger, is it needs to support an entire gurney, right? But there are many ways to transport a patient in Europe and other places Asia, where they have smaller elevators. They have chairs that can be used to assist and transport them if need be. They're analyzing other codes. They're looking at the parking requirements much more. Other technical things like ventilation in buildings, whether like single line or multi-line. I don't know all that stuff. That's for our mechanical engineer, Sonny, to worry about. It should be somewhere here, but the point of the story is there's opportunities to reduce housing costs by fixing certain things in the code, or at least assessing them and say, does this really fit for Guam? Is this what we really need? Rather than full adoption without any review. So they make a couple of points. IBC is used across much of the United States, requires multifamily buildings with more than 3 stories to include 2 staircases, so drives inefficiency. Creates that double-loaded situation where now you have to have families on both sides instead of focusing on one side. So here's the recommendation, and I think they also mentioned that they're anticipating an update to address this in the IBC for 2027. I believe we're still in like 2009, so we're not even up to date. But the recommendation is not to wait till this happens, is to potentially go in, maybe talk with the building code council, talk with the engineers, we do our roundtables and see if we can get this corrected now. And so that, as people invest, remember housing development are long lead items. And then elevator reform. So it requires excessive cabin sizes and space and weight requirements, which limits the vendors to just a handful that are gonna meet that requirement. So they're recommending to allow elevators to also additionally meet standards set by the International Organization for Standardization, that as well conforms with the latest standards set by the American Society of Mechanical Engineers. I know it's very dry, but I am actually almost done, and I think we may be ahead of schedule, right? And then we may be able to take questions, even though it's not on the agenda, but I'll leave that to my boss to decide. All right, streamlining. Oh, Lord, this is always fun. Just when I thought I can't get more boring. All right, so what we're looking at, some of the recommendations provided, looking at Guam specifically in our processes to get projects online. We want to make sure that, if there are exceptions or streamlining process, that they're intentional, right? They're very specific and objective, how we're going to move that forward, what we're trying to move forward. So, for example, conditional use permits and special permits are often subject. Okay, I'm quoting this, okay, so don't get mad if I say this, all right? But I thought it's worth saying. I cited it too. Conditional uses and special permits are often subject to discretionary votes by a council or board, or to discretionary decisions by administrative staff with little or no advance guidance to assist the applicant. This discretionary system of approval creates uncertainty and is susceptible to corruption. For 2024, okay, they said it, not me. I don't think that's happening now, but what we're trying to say is we need to look at these policies, what fits and doesn't fit. Conditional use used to be the blanket for anything that wasn't covered in the zoning, particularly because the zoning hadn't been updated in 1952. But we need to move past the catch-all with an assumption that there's all these experts, in the council and land management that are magically going to know what the heck's going on, right? So let's look at updating the list of authorized uses versus conditional uses so that the time invested in the government on actual conditional use permits and special permits is really focused in on driving in, right? And not necessarily focused in on, Nana's house in the back with her one shower and her, as an example. So one other thing that's been recommended, we don't necessarily do this on Guam, is to allow for third-party reviews of building plans and permits. Now, before everyone freaks out, developers submit a variety of documents in their applications for permits, which often leads to backlogs, understaffing at permitting departments. It can really result in long delays. Now, we don't do this on Guam because we don't have other cities close by. We don't have the state we can depend on. Many of them allow, they'll have interworking relationships where they help with that backlog. But many of the cities that don't have that, they allow developers at their own expense to hire third-party reviewers. So the third-party reviewers, you make sure they're audited. You make sure there's licensing requirements. You make sure they have professional liability insurance. Or you can even do risk-based bonding. You can have, potential third-party reviewers be bonded companies, right, to ensure that protection. And we're not talking about them reviewing and just taking over the job of the government, right? Obviously, government needs to look. But what we're proposing is that, the limited government resources we have focus on the higher risk projects, right? Not look at every single housing development project. And we, as an example, there could be we're proposing the development of a ranking development based on risk level. So as an example, low risk building types or environmental risk factors. For example, low risk are single family developings, right? Third party reviewer goes in there, developer one or Mr. Perez, and sorry, I'm just saying Mr. Perez because I met him today. Hello, Mr. Tom Perez. Mr. Tom Perez wants to build a single family house, right? He submits his document, third party reviewer confirms that it's connected to sewer, okay? Confirms, the structural plans still need to go to DPW, or maybe it goes to an architectural firm who signs off on it. And then they transmit that to DPW, and it's done, right? But to have EPA with their limited staff, to have, every other person on that permit checklist, and if you've never done that process, everyone should try it at least once, right? Like jumping out of an airplane. Okay. But it's pretty intensive, right? But to have every government organization go through that scrutiny for every tiny project there's a reason why housing is just not getting constructed. It's a simple math game. Not enough time, a lot of demand, not enough resources, all of those things. It's just, nothing will move unless we do something forward. So maybe consider for low-risk properties, having bonded, licensed, insured, third-party reviewers be able to take care of those, so we can place our limited resources to really take the time to look at the high-risk projects, because that's where we want them, right? The last one is limited parking mandates. So this is always a touchy one. On-site parking spaces mandated by Guam, they really do occupy valuable land. It can add tens of thousands of dollars of the cost of each dwelling. For example, Colorado's legislature, in 2024 enacted parking minimums for most family residentials with they removed the parking minimum. So if they had less than 20 units, there was no parking minimum. Not saying you have to do that exactly, but something to consider, right? Readjusting that amount. We want to try to drive demand towards more public transportation, right? Reduce congestion on the road, reduce wear and tear. But it's one of those things, whether you're gonna have the cart or the bull. We can have a wonderful transportation system, but if there's no need to use the transportation system, nobody's gonna use it. Then there's no funding for it. Then it's not maintained. So if we want more of it, we need to start driving that demand for it. I'm not saying overnight, but something to consider. I like to use, as you know, metaphors and examples when I discuss, but as wonderful as the new, I don't know if I could get sued for this, as wonderful as Don Don Donkey is, and I love going there, right? You ever just look at that parking lot, aside from the first day they open, and be like, wow, wow. I don't know what type of flea market you're going to have there, but the cars tend to occupy more space and have more opportunities to house than our own people, right? So we need meaningful and common sense looks at what we can do, right? Let's not try to over micromanage or over legislate what can be done, right? Guam is not 1952 anymore, to be honest. We are really, there's a huge gap between a rural community and urban community, huge gap. And we don't have the USDA folks here, but they can nerd you out about what that gap is all day long. But we're in the middle there. We're far from the urban environment we were before when we created these laws and had a population of 30,000. We're definitely not that anymore. But we're also not San Francisco. And I got three more, and we're done, okay? And then everyone can eat, and you won't have to hear me talk anymore, and I can finally rest, because the stress will be off my mind. Let's go into residential and commercial zone, another recommendation also known as RICS. So in Guam, residential units are limited in commercial zones by statute. The law right now, 21 GCA 61307, you can only put a duplex, up to a duplex, in a commercial zone, right? So the idea of mixed-use developments, aside from the lengthy process of a conditional use, is pretty much impossible, right? So, of course, the recommendation is to go take a look at that. As I was joking, but also serious, you could put a duplex on a commercial building, but if you go into the law, section 61306, you can build a hotel in a R2, right? So some inconsistencies that we need to fix. The RICS policies are applicable generally to buildings in a zone that allows and is predominantly occupied by office and retail space. Because remember, what we're trying to promote are people to have communities, at a minimum to easily be able to access work, right? So we do have commercial and pretty developed, robust commercial areas on this island, right? And those would be prime candidates to allow this opportunity to have people, these weird conversions, not necessarily a planned mixed-use development, but more of a conversion of a mixed-use development. The RICS is different from a mixed-use development in that in a RICS, the primary focus of that building is commercial activities with the secondary focus on housing, versus a mixed-use development where it's a primary focus on housing with mixed-in commercial development. That makes sense? I should have drew a picture for this one. So I'm not going to go into the base building requirements. These are some recommendations from NGA. Obviously, would need a bit more vetting. I'm not too set on this, but these are just general recommendations they're putting forward. Commercial conversion, as an example, right? The commercial building code is the most stringent building code. So if you can build a house, it's definitely not as safe building code-wise as a multi-unit commercial facility, right, where every single wall is a firewall. And so it would probably be the best candidate, especially commercial areas or commercial buildings that are not really being occupied, or where there may not be a demand, to have an ability to convert that into, through RICS, into a residential type facility, right, to maximize the use. Especially because, real estate to a degree should move with the need of the community, right? What might have been a commercial building and needed then may be a housing, and allowing for that, especially so we don't have derelict buildings, sitting vacant because demand is not there, right? So providing those opportunities. So the ability to repurpose underutilized commercial buildings, and also to encourage mixed-use activities, and to start closing the gap really on our one-bedroom units, which, as I previously mentioned, is about 11 to 12% of our total inventory. The other proposal, this is more of a consumer protection, and I'll probably get a lot of nasty grams for this one. I'm sorry, Gar. Jokes. Prohibition on source of income discrimination. Really looking at this as a consumer protection. Right now, source of income discrimination is prohibited in 22 states and the District of Columbia. And what we believe in, what we're proposing, is that the fair market should allow everyone an opportunity to participate in the market if they have valid income, regardless of the source. And so what we're talking about by source of income could be veteran disability, retirement, public assistance, alimony, child support, right? As long as they can prove that the money is consistent, that they can prove it's steady, that they can prove the amount, that they shouldn't be discriminated or not, at least provided an opportunity to apply or see a house or get vetted for housing. It's also provides protections to the consumers against price gouging in any form, especially now as we have a limited supply and high demand. And so source of income discrimination ranges from outright denial, meaning they won't even talk with you, they won't answer your call, they won't let you see the unit, to price gouging, right? yeah, I advertised it for $900, but since you're Section 8, your price is $1,400, right? Or, hey, I found out you're military, even though I advertised it for $800, I'm going to charge you $3,000, right? You know, from a consumer protection aspect, all we're saying is put your price out there and honor it, right? Nobody goes to Kmart or Donkey and buys something, and then you go to the register and they change the price on you because they find out where your money's coming from. That doesn't work in any, you can't have a fair market with that kind of practice anywhere. And so we are proposing that as a consumer protection, also housing legislation. And it's also been found to be an alternative for violations of the Fair Housing Act, right? So they may use your source of income as a means to not provide you a housing opportunity as a guise because, you know, they don't like you're from Micronesia, right? You're Filipino or whatever the case may be. It's another means to discriminate against the protected classes through their source of income. And so all we're proposing is require your prices to be transparent, right? If you're renting to Section 8, if you're renting to the general public, if you're renting to the military, be transparent with your price, right? So if you're gonna look at a unit, hey, my unit is $800, how much I think it's worth. So whether you're anyone in the market, you're getting the price that's being offered. So source of income discrimination. And then the last one, not completely, this is not an absolute requirement. This is just a potential tool for the legislature to consider. Tax reduction for traditional multifamily units. So Public Law 35-1 increased taxes on real property improvements assessed at over $1 million. So this resulted in a doubling of the property taxes for traditional apartment units, and likely they've passed that on to the renter. And it was kind of a catch-all for included condos. So basically any improvement over $1 million. So what we're proposing is that your traditional apartment complex, your traditional multifamily unit, provided that they can prove, I take that back, I apologize. As construction cost is going up, what you're finding is that more traditional apartments will see their tax increases. So you're gonna see apartment complexes. What we don't wanna happen is you're gonna see these rental units, right? Where the owner is not putting any money into it. Because if they invest in it, if they improve it, if they make it look nicer, what's gonna happen? Their taxes are gonna go up, because it's already doubled. And so what we're proposing is to remove that, not to disincentivize the potential improvements or modernizations because they're trying to avoid higher tax values. So we should consider reducing improvement tax on traditional apartment units, provided that their tax savings are passed on. So for example, if I have a 21 unit and I can benefit from a tax reduction on it, then it doesn't mean anything to me. And so long as I can prove that I'm not increasing the rents on my folks relative to the tax increase, it be the legislature passing through that savings to the end user or consumer. So it's as an option. And you know, the traditional multifamily owner doesn't have to do it, but it's a potential option that they can undertake. Otherwise, they're just gonna pass that on to the renter. And those that are renting these traditional multifamily units are the least likely, have the least capability to absorb the additional cost or tax burden. Alternatively, we could consider deferring increases on traditional apartment units. So when they do the tax increase, I think they're required to do it every 5 years or so, 5 or 10 years, is to maybe consider skipping. So if you're, hey, in these traditional multifamily units, you're not getting a tax reassessment until maybe 5 years from now, or you skip. So then that way, they're not disincentivized to invest back in their property, right? Which is gonna be to the benefit of those in the community. And so if I'm doing a time check, we are at 10:54. Yes? So we have a little time maybe for questions. Ms. Liz, would you open up for questions? Because I am done. And I am so glad to be done. Thank you. Questions? So we have about 6 minutes until lunch. We'll go ahead and, I think there was someone who had a question, so I guess we'll just take it. Yes, sir.
Yeah, those are some really great ideas that you guys are proposing. I was looking at the ADUs. I'm thinking that's something that could be really quick response on Guam if that gets approved. What would be the biggest obstacle for something like that to just get done?
Over-regulating it. Yeah. I think having the roundtable and really community involvement too. I don't think the community understands what it takes to put up a building on Guam. It really takes a lot. You got tropical code, you got the building code, you got these really old regulations, and a lot of the people who do any development, they got to go through a lot of loopholes. And so maybe there's opportunities in the roundtables building up to the ADUs is to help the public understand that what it takes to just build something simple is a lot already. And even if we just leave that alone, that's okay, but maybe not add on additional regulations or requirements to make it so burdensome, it's not even worthwhile to anybody. Because I'll tell you, the regular household, the regular person, or Mr. Perez gonna build it for Nana, they're not going to be able to get through that whole process. That's not a process for regular people, the normal building code process. So simplifying it, over-regulating it, making it too difficult, that's the biggest barrier that I foresee. Sir? Oh, thank you. Sidus Masi. And one more speaker. Oh, that's right. 11. Okay. Oh. Sorry. All right, one more question and then we're turning it over. I guess I ran overtime. I apologize. The presentation will work and we're going to publish it online. Thanks. Audrey, go ahead. Sorry, Roger.